She stood on a wooden platform built from stolen timber, her wrists bound, while men with money in their pockets decided whether she was worth more than a good horse. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't protest either. They just watched. The way people watch something wrong happening when they've already convinced themselves there's nothing they can do. Maris Hale was 24 years old, owed a debt she never signed for, and was about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder in broad daylight. Then a rider appeared at the far end of the street, and everything changed. If this story hit you, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackthorn Crossing and find out what really happened that day. The auction was scheduled for noon, which told you something about the men running it. They weren't hiding. They weren't ashamed. They'd done this before, probably a dozen times in a dozen dusty towns across the frontier, and not once had anyone stopped them. So they set it for noon. High sun, full visibility, the whole town able to see, because confidence was its own kind of power out here. It said, "We own this place, and you know it." Blackthorn Crossing wasn't much to look at, even on a good day. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, surrounded by scrub brush and red clay earth that cracked in summer and turned to boot-sucking mud in the wet months. The main street was maybe 400 yards long, lined with buildings that leaned slightly, as if they were tired. A general store, a feed depot, a saloon with a broken shutter that banged in the wind and had been banging for 2 years because nobody bothered to fix it, a land office with fresh paint, the only fresh paint in the whole settlement, that told you exactly where the real money lived. The auction platform had been erected in front of the land office. That wasn't an accident either. Maris Hale heard the hammering from inside the jailhouse, where she'd been held for 3 days on a debt charge that shouldn't have been legal and probably wasn't. But legal didn't carry much weight in Blackthorn Crossing when the men writing the laws were the same men collecting the debts. She sat on the floor with her back against the stone wall and listened to each nail being driven, and she didn't cry. She'd already cried. The first night, when the deputy had thrown her in and turned the key and told her it was just business. She'd cried then because she was alone and scared and the night was cold. But she'd stop by morning. Crying wasn't going to get her off that platform. Her father's debt. That was the beginning of all of it. Caleb Hale had borrowed $240 from a man named Silas Greer 6 years ago, when the drought had killed 2 consecutive harvests, and the family had been 3 weeks from starving. $240 at what Greer had told him was a reasonable rate. What Greer hadn't mentioned, or had buried in language Caleb couldn't fully read, was that the rate compounded monthly, and that the collateral clause extended to all family assets including labor claims. Caleb had died of fever 18 months later, leaving behind a small piece of land, a broken plow, a milk cow that died the following spring, and a debt that had grown, by the time Maris turned 20, to over $900. She'd tried to fight it. She'd gone to the land office twice, once alone and once with a letter she'd spent a week writing, laying out every error she could identify in the original contract. Both times she'd been told to come back later. The third time, a man named Decker, broad-shouldered, slow-eyed, worked for Greer as a kind of enforcer-accountant hybrid, had come to her door instead and told her the debt was now over $1,000, and if she didn't make arrangements, they'd make them for her. She'd run. She'd made it 40 miles north before 2 deputies caught up with her on the Saline Creek Road and brought her back in chains. That had been 3 days ago. Now it was noon, and someone was unlocking the jailhouse door. The deputy who came for her was a young man named Cord, maybe 22, with a thin mustache he was clearly proud of and eyes that couldn't quite meet hers. He'd brought shackles for her wrists, which he put on apologetically, as if the gentleness of the motion canceled out what the shackles meant. "You don't have to do this," Maris said. "I know," Cord said. He didn't say anything else. He took her arm and walked her out into the sunlight. The street was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd imagined maybe a handful of men. The bidders, Greer's people, a few bystanders. But it seemed like half the settlement had turned out, standing along the sides of the street in clusters, watching with that particular combination of guilt and curiosity that people wear when they know they're witnessing something wrong but can't bring themselves to leave. Children had been pulled back behind their mothers. Old men stood with their hats in their hands. A woman near the feed depot had turned entirely away, facing the wall. The platform was about 3 feet off the ground, with 4 steps up. Silas Greer stood beside it in a dark coat that was too heavy for the weather, the kind of coat a man wears when he wants to look substantial. He was maybe 55, with silver hair and a merchant's careful smile, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes, because it wasn't meant to reach the eyes. It was meant to communicate transaction. It said, "This is business, nothing personal, let's get through it cleanly." Beside him stood 2 men Maris didn't know, one heavy-set with a red beard, one thin and pale with the ledger tucked under his arm. Buyers, she assumed, or representatives of buyers. There were 3 more men standing near the steps to the platform, armed. Not deputies, but Greer's men. Decker was there too, standing slightly to the side, thumbs in his belt, watching her walk up the street with an expression of professional detachment. Greer's smile widened slightly when he saw her. "Miss Hale," he said, "let's get this settled." "You won't get away with this," Maris said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "I already have," Greer said simply, and gestured to the steps. One of the armed men put a hand on her arm and guided her up. She went because the alternative was being dragged, and she would not be dragged. She climbed the steps and stood on the platform in the noon sun and looked out at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at her, and nobody said a word. Greer climbed up beside her. He had a paper in his hand. "Good people of Blackthorn Crossing," he began, and his voice had a practiced carrying quality to it, the voice of a man who'd spoken in front of crowds before. "We're here today to settle a matter of lawful debt obligation. Maris Hale, formerly of the Hale homestead on the South Creek, carries a debt of $1,114 against the Greer Land and Finance Company, secured by labor claim under the original contract terms. In the absence of liquid assets sufficient to satisfy this debt, we're proceeding to labor assignment by open bid, duration to be determined by outstanding balance at standard rate of service." He made it sound like a land sale, like it was routine, like standing a woman on a platform with her wrists bound and offering her to the highest bidder was just another line in the ledger. "Bidding will open at $300, Greer said. "Who'll start us?" Silence for a moment. Then the heavy man with the red beard raised 2 fingers. 300. Maris fixed her eyes on a point above the crowd's heads. She would not look at them. She would not give Greer or Decker or any of them the satisfaction of seeing her face while they did this. 300 from Mr. Calloway, Greer said. "Do I hear 350? The thin man with the ledger nodded once. 350. From the far side of the street, a third voice. 400. The bidding moved quickly after that, the way these things do when men with money start competing with each other. It wasn't really about her. She understood that. It was about the land. Whoever held her labor claim would also hold leverage over the homestead property, which sat on good water. The land was the real prize. She was just the mechanism. 500, Calloway said. 550, the thin man countered. 600. 650. Greer was smiling. Decker was making notes. Maris stared at the space above the crowd and kept her breathing even and thought about the river. She used to go to the South Creek when she was a girl and sit in the shallows and watch the water bugs skate across the surface. She thought about that. She thought about it very deliberately, because if she stopped thinking about the river, she would start thinking about what came next, and she couldn't afford to do that right now. 700, Calloway said. 750. 800. Greer turned to the crowd. $800. Fine offer. Do I hear? The sound reached the crowd before anyone saw him. A single horse at a steady canter coming in from the north end of the street. People turned. The murmur started at the back and rippled forward. Maris heard it. She turned her head and looked. Git. The horse was a dark bay, road-dusted and lean, the kind of animal that had covered serious ground recently. The rider sat easy in the saddle, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long coat that had gone gray with trail dust. He wore his hat pulled low, and he wasn't hurrying. He rode down the center of the street at that same steady canter, and the crowd parted for him without quite knowing why. The way crowds will sometimes part for a person whose presence has a particular weight to it. Maris had never seen him before, but she watched him the way everyone else watched him, with that involuntary attention that certain people command. He pulled up maybe 30 feet from the platform. His horse stopped clean, no prancing. The rider looked at the platform. He looked at Maris, then he looked at Greer. "Is this still open?" he said. His voice was unhurried, not loud, but it carried. Greer studied him for a moment, recalibrating. "Bidding is in progress, yes." "Then I'll bid." The rider reached into his coat. He produced a leather pouch and held it up. $1,500 in paper currency. Anybody want to count it? I'll wait. The crowd went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Before, it had been the silence of discomfort. This was the silence of shock. Calloway turned around, jaw tight. The thin man had stopped writing. Decker looked at Greer. Greer's merchant smile had shifted into something more careful. He was doing arithmetic behind his eyes. The debt was $1,100, the bid was $1,500, the surplus was $400 clear profit. Whatever his concern about this stranger, the numbers were appealing. "The gentleman bids $1,500, Greer said slowly. "Do I hear—" "That's not a gentleman," Calloway said, loud enough for the street to hear. "That's Rhett Vance." Another silence. Maris watched the name move through the crowd like a cold wind moving through grass, visible in the way people leaned away, shifted their weight, put more space between themselves and the rider. The rider, Vance, didn't react. He sat on his horse with the pouch of money in one hand and waited, as if the conversation was proceeding at the pace he expected. "Rhett Vance," Greer repeated. His smile was still present, but it had become purely mechanical. "I wasn't aware you were in the territory. I travel around," Vance said. "You have a reputation," Greer said carefully. "Most people do," Vance said. "You going to take the bid or not?" Greer looked at Decker. Decker looked at the three armed men near the platform. The armed men looked at Vance with the careful, professional attention of men who were good at violence and recognized they might be outclassed. Calloway stepped forward. "Greer, you can't sell to this man. He's wanted in Dobson County." "Warrant's been cleared," Vance said without looking at Calloway. "Check with the circuit marshal's office if you want to spend the afternoon on it." Calloway's jaw worked. He looked at Greer. Greer looked at the money. $400 of clear surplus right there. $1,500, Greer said, and now his voice had the formal cadence of conclusion. "Going once, you're making a mistake," Calloway said. "Going twice." Calloway said something under his breath and turned away. "Sold," Greer said, "to Mr. Vance." Vance dismounted. He looped his reins over the rail without tying them. Just looped, which meant the horse would stand but could be taken quickly, and walked to the platform. He mounted the steps without being invited, which made one of Greer's men reach for his gun before thinking better of it. He stopped in front of Maris. She looked at him steadily. He was maybe 35, lean-faced, with 3 days of beard and eyes that were a particular shade of pale gray that she associated with overcast sky before rain. There was a scar that ran from the left side of his jaw to just below his ear, thin and white, old enough to have settled into the skin. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who'd been through a considerable amount of trouble and was probably in the process of getting into more. "My name is Rhett Vance," he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear it. "I know what you're thinking. I need you to hold it for right now and walk with me." "You just bought me," she said, her voice flat. "No," he said. "I just stopped the auction. There's a difference. I'll explain it when we're not standing on a platform in front of 50 people." He took a small key from his pocket and reached for the shackles on her wrists. One of Greer's men stepped forward immediately. "Those stay on until the paperwork's signed," the man said. Vance looked at him, just looked. The man held his position for 3 or 4 seconds and then stepped back. Vance unlocked the shackles. They fell to the platform boards with a hollow clank. Maris rubbed her wrists. The skin was raw. "Walk with me," Vance said again. He turned and went down the steps. She stood on the platform for a moment longer. The crowd was watching. Greer was watching. Decker had his pencil still poised over his paper, as if waiting for something to write down. She went down the steps. The land office had a side room they used for the signing of documents. a narrow space with a table and 3 chairs and a window that faced the alley. Greer led them there himself, with Decker and the thin man with the ledger following. One of the armed men stood in the doorway. Vance sat down across from Greer and took the pouch of money from his coat and set it on the table. He also set down a folded paper. "What's that?" Greer asked, nodding at the paper. "Bill of particulars," Vance said. "Standard settlement document. It certifies that the debt against Maris Hale is fully discharged, no remaining labor claim, no lien against the homestead property, no right of recollection." Greer looked at the paper without touching it. "The standard arrangement doesn't include homestead release." "This one does," Vance said. "The property lien is a separate instrument. It wasn't included in the auction terms." "At it now," Vance said. He reached back into his coat and produced a second pouch, considerably smaller than the first. He set it beside the larger one. 200 more. That covers the lien." Decker leaned down to Greer's ear. They held a brief, murmured exchange. Maris stood beside the window and watched. She was doing math in her head, not the arithmetic of the negotiation, but a different kind, trying to calculate what a man pays $1,700 for, if not what everyone assumed he was buying. "All right," Greer said finally. He pulled the bill of particulars toward him and read it, slowly, with the attention of a man looking for the clause that was going to cost him. He found nothing. He looked at Vance. "This is a full discharge and clear title restoration," Greer said. "Yes," Vance said. "That's not what was being sold today." It is now," Vance said. Another pause. Greer looked at the 2 pouches of money. He looked at the document. He looked at Vance, and in that look Maris saw something pass between the 2 men that she didn't entirely understand. Not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of recognition, the way 2 people sometimes know things about each other that haven't been spoken aloud. Greer picked up a pen. He signed the document. "Dwight." They were in the alley behind the land office within 10 minutes, moving fast but not running. Vance had her walking slightly ahead of him, which meant he had clear sight of the alley's entrance and exit, and she was not between him and either one. She noticed this. "Where's your horse?" he asked. "I don't have a horse. They took everything when they arrested me." He swore under his breath. "We'll need to fix that." He was scanning the alley, the backs of the buildings, the slice of Main Street visible at the far end. "Do you know anyone in this town you trust?" She considered. "Adeline Marsh. She runs the boarding house on the north end. She hid my papers when I was arrested. Deed copies? Some correspondence?" "Good. We need those papers." "Why?" "Because they're evidence," he said. "And evidence is the only thing that's going to matter when this is finished." She stopped walking. He took 2 steps before he realized she'd stopped and turned back. "When what is finished?" she said. "What exactly are you doing here?" Vance looked at her for a moment. He glanced back at the alley entrance, checking it, then returned his attention to her. "Greer and the men he works with have been running debt schemes across 4 territories for the better part of a decade," he said. "Fraudulent contracts, inflated rates, labor auctions. Yours isn't the first. It won't be the last unless someone stops it. I've been building a case, documenting what they've done, collecting testimony, gathering contracts. I need witnesses. I need people whose stories are attached to real paperwork." He paused. "I need you." Maris stared at him. "You spent $1,700 to get a witness?" Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the edge of one. "Among other things." "What other things?" "I wasn't going to let them do it," he said simply, and the lack of ceremony in his voice made it land harder than it would have if he'd dressed it up. "Whatever else is true, I wasn't going to sit at the end of that street and watch them put a woman on a block, so I didn't." She studied him. His face wasn't easy to read. Not closed, exactly, but careful. The face of someone who'd learned to keep his reactions from getting there before his thoughts. "You said you'd explain the difference," she said, "between buying me and stopping the auction. The document Greer signed gives you clear title and full discharge. You're not indebted to me. You don't owe me labor or service or anything else. What I paid is gone. My money, my choice, my loss." He said it without self-congratulation. "You're free. What I'm asking is whether you'll help me of your own choice, Because your story is one of the clearest examples I've got, and your documentation, if Marsh has what you say she has, might be enough to bring this in front of a real court. And if I say no, then I'll take you somewhere safe and you can start rebuilding, he said. I won't like it, but that's your right. Maris was quiet for a moment. The broken shutter on the saloon banged distantly. Somewhere further up the street she could hear voices. Greer's men, maybe, or Calloway's, she couldn't tell. You said Greer works with other men, she said. A syndicate. 6 principals, maybe a dozen active operators. They have interests in land, cattle, water rights, supply contracts. The debt schemes are how they expand. They pick up property from people who can't pay, and they add the labor to their operations. They've been doing it long enough that they're woven into the legal structure of 4 territories. Sheriffs, land registrars, circuit judges. Some of them are bought. Some of them are just afraid. He paused. It's bigger than one crooked auction in Blackthorn Crossing. How much bigger? Bigger than I can take down alone, he said. It came out plainly, without the false modesty of understatement. I need people who have standing, who were directly harmed, who have documentation, who are willing to testify. I have contacts at the federal marshal's level who will move if I can give them something solid enough. But solid enough is a high bar. Maris looked at the alley exit, then back at him. Adeline's boarding house. North end, cream-colored door, window boxes with dead flowers. She's been trying to keep those flowers alive for 3 years, and they keep dying on her. Vance nodded. I'll help you, she said. But I'm not following your lead. We work as equals, or we don't work at all. He looked at her for a moment with that almost smile again. Fair enough. And I want a horse, she said. Working on it. Adeline Marsh was 60, heavy-set, and moved through her boarding house with the compressed authority of a woman who had run a demanding operation for a long time and didn't have patience for nonsense. When Vance knocked at her back door and she opened it to find Maris beside him, she made a sound that was half relief and half displeasure. I heard the hammer fall, Adeline said, looking at Vance with plain suspicion. Who's this? Rhett Vance, Maris said. He paid off the debt. The whole thing. Greer signed a full discharge. Adeline looked at Vance for a long moment, then back at Maris. And you trust him? Not entirely, Maris said honestly. Vance said nothing. At least you're not stupid, Adeline said, and stepped back to let them in. The back room of the boarding house smelled of coffee and something baking. Adeline sat them at the kitchen table and went to a cupboard, moved aside a row of canned goods, and produced a folded oilcloth packet tied with twine. She set it in front of Maris without comment. Maris untied it. Inside, a copy of the original debt contract between Caleb Hale and Silas Greer, dated 6 years back. 2 letters her father had written, never sent, apparently, describing the terms as he'd understood them. The deed to the homestead property, and a single sheet of paper in her own handwriting, a careful listing of every payment the family had made over 6 years, with dates and amounts, totaling over $300. She'd put it together in the months before they'd come for her, when she'd still believed there might be a legal remedy. She pushed it across the table to Vance. He read through it systematically, not quickly. He read the contract twice. When he looked up, his expression had shifted. Still careful, but with something beneath it that she read as genuine interest. The rate disclosure, he said. It's on the 3rd page in a margin notation, half the size of the main text. I know, Maris said. I found it the second time I read it. My father never would have. He was a good farmer and a poor reader. Did anyone else sign this contract? Any witnesses? Decker, she said. As Greer's representative. Vance nodded slowly. I have 3 other contracts from 3 other families, all with the same structure. Different names, different debts, same mechanism. Margin notation, compounding rate, labor claim clause. He tapped the paper. Yours is the clearest. The payment record you kept makes it... He stopped. This is very good work, he said, and there was something in his voice that was neither flattery nor routine praise. It was simply acknowledgement, the way you'd acknowledge a well-laid joint in a fence post. Competence recognized by competence. Maris hadn't expected that to matter to her as much as it did. I went to the land office twice, she said. They wouldn't hear me. They wouldn't, Vance said. Burkhart, the land registrar, is on Greer's payroll, has been for 4 years. But the federal circuit level is different. I have a contact there, a marshal named Tate, who's been building cases against frontier fraud operations for the better part of 3 years. He's been waiting for documentation solid enough to justify a full investigation. He looked at the papers on the table. This might be it, combined with what I have. Where is Tate? Adeline asked from the stove, where she'd started pouring coffee. 40 miles south, in Crenshaw. That's 2 days' ride, Maris said. 1.5 if we move, Vance said. Adeline set a cup in front of each of them. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at Vance with an expression that had moderated slightly from suspicion to evaluation. What happens when Greer figures out where you're going? She asked. He probably already knows, Vance said, or he'll know inside the hour. Calloway will tell him what I've been doing in the territory, and Greer is smart enough to put it together. So they'll come after you, Adeline said. Yes. And the girl goes with you into that. It's her choice, Vance said. He looked at Maris. It's a real risk. Greer has enough money to hire serious people. The road to Crenshaw goes through territory where the deputies work for men who work for Greer. I won't pretend otherwise. Maris curled her hands around the coffee cup. The ceramic was warm against her raw wrists. She thought about her father, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight, reading that contract with his lips moving, believing the man across from him was being straight with him. She thought about the auction platform and the hammer and the crowd standing there in silence. She thought about 3 years of payments that had made the debt bigger, not smaller. I'll need boots, she said. They took mine. And if you can't get me a horse before we leave, I'm not riding double for 40 miles. I don't care what's chasing us. Adeline made a sound that might have been approval. I have a horse, she said. Old one, but steady. Take her. She's yours, not alone. Maris looked at her. Adeline, don't, Adeline said firmly. Don't thank me. Just go do what needs doing. Bossum. They left Blackthorn Crossing in the last hour of the afternoon, when the light had gone amber and the shadows stretched long across the dust. Adeline's horse was a gray mare of indeterminate age, with a placid disposition and a gait that was comfortable over distance. Exactly the kind of animal you wanted for a long road when time mattered more than speed. They rode north out of town, not south, Vance's call, and Maris didn't argue with it. Going south directly would put them on the main road to Crenshaw, which was the obvious route. They'd circle around using a cattle path that ran along the ridge's western face and rejoin the road 20 miles out, past the last of Greer's immediate influence. For the first hour, they rode in silence, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were assessing each other and didn't feel the need to fill the space with talk while they did it. The land out here was hard and beautiful, in the way that land is when nobody's managed to fully claim it yet. The scrub gave way to scattered pines as they climbed, and the air cooled and smelled of resin and dry grass. A hawk turned lazy circles somewhere above them. Distant, a coyote sounded off, once, and then went quiet. Eventually, Maris said, How long have you been doing this? Gathering the case? All of it, whatever it is you do. Vance considered. The case specifically, about 8 months, but I've been moving around the frontier for going on 12 years, I suppose. As a gunman. Sometimes, he said. Not always. Calloway was scared of you, she said. The whole crowd was. My reputation is, he paused, choosing the word, larger than the reality. Most reputations are, out here. The frontier runs on story. A man does something notable once, and then the story gets added to every time someone tells it, and by the time it's traveled 3 territories, the original event is barely recognizable. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've also been in the wrong place at the right time and gotten credit for things I didn't do. He was quiet for a moment. It's useful sometimes. Today it was useful. And inconvenient other times. Yes, he said, considerably. The cattle path narrowed, and they rode single file for a stretch, Vance behind her. She could hear his horses breathing and the steady sound of hooves on packed earth. When the path widened again and they came back abreast, she said, Calloway said you were wanted in Dobson County. I was, he said. That's true. The warrant was cleared 8 weeks ago, like I told Greer. The original charge was assaulting a deputy. The deputy in question was in the process of burning down a family's homestead because they wouldn't sell to his employer. I objected. Objected, she repeated. Physically, he said. He came out of it with a broken arm and a story that made me sound considerably more dramatic. It took 8 weeks and a sworn statement from the family's oldest daughter to get the warrant cleared. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the path ahead, his face set in that same watchful calm. You do this a lot, she said. Show up and get involved in things that aren't my business? I was going to say help people, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I grew up watching men like Greer operate, he said. Different names, same structure. My father lost his land to one of them when I was 11. My mother took work as a laundress for a rancher's wife and worked herself down to nothing over 6 years, and then died of something the doctor said was exhaustion, which isn't a diagnosis, it's just an honest description. He paused. I spent a long time being angry about that, and angry didn't accomplish much. Eventually, I figured out that the only thing that actually moves the needle is evidence. Courts move on evidence. Federal marshals move on evidence. Political pressure moves on evidence. So that's what I collect. She absorbed this. The sun was lower now, painting the ridgeline ahead in shades of copper and rust. You should have told me this on the platform, she said. You had enough to deal with on the platform, he said. She thought about that and decided he was probably right. They made camp at dark in a hollow between two rock outcroppings, high enough to see the flat land below and far enough from the main road that firelight wouldn't be visible to anyone traveling it. Vance built a small fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. No wasted motion, nothing showy, just the right amount of fuel in the right configuration. Maris ate hardtack and dried meat from Vance's supplies, and drank water from a creek nearby, and sat with her back against a rock and watched the embers. Her wrists still ached. Her whole body carried the tiredness of 3 days in a cell, followed by a half-day's hard riding. The other families, she said, the ones in the contracts you have, are they safe? 2 of them are. One family, the Pruitts, out of Saline Creek, I haven't been able to locate. Last information I had, they were in debt enforcement proceedings. That might mean they've been moved. His voice was flat on the last part, and the flatness told her what moved meant. Then we need to move faster, she said. We need to move smart, he said. Fast and stupid gets us both dead in a ditch and doesn't help the Pruitts. She looked at him across the fire. Have you done this before? Gotten evidence to a federal marshal and had it actually work? A long pause. Once, he said. Partial. The principals escaped prosecution, but their operation was dismantled and the land was returned to the families. 2 of the operators went to prison. He stared at the fire. It wasn't everything I wanted, it was something. That's an honest answer. I don't have another kind, he said. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the dark, a night bird called and got no answer. You could have just kept riding, Maris said. When you came into Blackthorn Crossing today, you didn't know me. You had no reason. I had a reason, he said. He didn't elaborate. She let it go. Some things didn't need to be pulled apart into words. The fire was small and warm, and the night was very large and quiet around them. And whatever was coming, the road south, Greer's men, the long, uncertain road towards something that might or might not be justice, it was still out there, waiting. But right now there was a fire and the smell of pine, and a horse that was steady over distance. That would have to be enough. Maris pulled her coat tighter and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 days she slept without waking until morning. She woke before dawn to the sound of Vance moving around the camp with that same unhurried efficiency she'd noticed the night before, not trying to be quiet exactly, but not making unnecessary noise either. The fire was already out, the gear already packed. He had coffee going on a small folded iron stand over a handful of coals, and the smell of it reached her before anything else did. How long have you been up? She asked. Couple hours, he said. She sat up and looked at the sky. The eastern ridge was just beginning to separate from the darkness, a thin line of gray defining where rock ended and sky began. Everything else was still night. You sleep at all? Some. He handed her a cup. It was too hot to drink comfortably, and she drank it anyway because the cold had settled into her joints overnight, and she needed it. We should move inside the hour. I want to clear the Dalton cutoff before full light. What's at the Dalton cutoff? Nothing, right now. But there's a relay station 2 miles past it that Greer's people use as a stop. If they put riders out last night, that's where they'd water their horses this morning. Maris stood, working the stiffness out of her back. She'd slept against a rock because it was the only flat surface and she'd chosen wrong. The rock had a seam in it that had pressed into her shoulder for 6 hours. She rolled the shoulder now, feeling it crack unpleasantly. You think they came after us already? Greer doesn't strike me as the kind of man who waits to see how things develop, Vance said. He was breaking down the small iron stand, folding it flat. He'll have sent someone last night. Question is who? Decker, she said immediately. He does Greer's enforcement work, has for years. Vance looked up. What do you know about him? He's patient, she said. Not like a careful man is patient, but like, he doesn't get excited about anything. He'll track something for weeks without losing interest. My father always said Decker was the one you actually needed to worry about, more than Greer himself. Greer is the money. Decker is the mechanism. Vance was quiet for a moment, processing that. He have men he uses? 3 that I know of. Harlow, who I've never heard speak a full sentence. 2 brothers named Cass. They're bad men, both of them, the kind who enjoy the work more than they should. She said it plainly, because it was plain fact, not because she wanted to frighten either of them. Vance nodded the way he took in most information, without visible reaction, folding it into whatever calculation he was already running. They broke camp in 15 minutes and were on the path before the sun cleared the ridge. The Dalton cutoff was a narrow split in the rock where a creek had cut down through the ridge over a few thousand years, leaving a passage just wide enough for 2 horses abreast. The creek was dry now, late in the season, its bed a floor of smooth, pale stones. Their horses' hooves rang against them with a sound that Maris didn't like. Too loud, too clear, the kind of sound that carried. Vance went through first, slowly, and she followed. On the far side, the land opened up again into a long, dry meadow that ran north to south, and the relay station was visible about 2 miles south, a low building with a corral beside it, smoke coming from the chimney. Vance stopped his horse at the meadow's edge, in the shadow of the rock. 2 horses in the corral, he said quietly. Maris looked. He was right. 2 horses, both dark, both saddled but with the saddles loosened, watered and rested but not turned out, meaning whoever had ridden them in was planning to ride out again soon. Decker? She asked. Or Calloway's men? Could be either. He sat for a moment, thinking. We go around, there's a way. It'll cost us an hour. She looked at the station. Something about the 2 saddled horses in the morning light put a cold feeling in her chest that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. An hour's better than the alternative, she said. They went around, cutting east through rougher country, following a deer trail that wound through broken rock and dry brush. It cost them the hour Vance had estimated and left both horses winded. But when they came back onto the main road 12 miles south of the relay station, there was nothing behind them. For the moment. They were 3 hours into the morning when Vance told her about the Pruitt family. It came out gradually, the way hard information often does. Not as a single disclosure, but in pieces, each piece connected to the last by a thread of context. He'd been explaining the structure of Greer's operation, how the debt instruments were written and how the labor claims were enforced. And then he said, the Pruitts had the best documented case of any family I found. Abel Pruitt kept records the way a man keeps records when he knows something's wrong but can't prove it yet. Dates, names, descriptions of conversations. He had a ledger that tracked every interaction with Greer's men over 4 years. Had, Maris said. 4 months ago I went to their homestead and found it empty, Vance said. Neighbors said Greer's men came in the night with a writ of seizure. Abel Pruitt was taken on a debt judgment. His wife and the 2 younger children got out. A neighbor hid them. But Abel and the oldest son went with Decker's men, and nobody's seen them since. The road ran straight here, through flat scrubland, and there was nowhere to look but forward. Maris looked forward. You're telling me they disappeared, she said. I'm telling you I don't know where they are, Vance said, which is not quite the same thing. There are labor operations in the Northern Territory, mine sites primarily, that take in debt labor without keeping public records. It's possible the Pruitts are there. It's possible they're somewhere else. I don't have confirmation either way. But you think they're alive? A pause. I think Greer is smart enough to know that dead bodies are evidence and working men are assets. I think alive is more useful to him. He paused again, shorter this time. I think I don't know for certain, and I won't pretend otherwise. Maris absorbed this for a long stretch of road. The sun was up properly now, warm on the left side of her face, and the scrubland smelled of dry sage and something faintly metallic she'd always associated with iron-rich soil. The ledger Abel Pruitt kept, she said. You have it? No, but I know where it might be. Where? Abel's wife, Hannah. She and the children are in Crenshaw, staying with her sister. I haven't been able to contact her directly. I sent a letter 3 weeks ago and got no response. He glanced at her. She may not trust anyone connected to what happened to her husband, which would be reasonable. I could talk to her, Maris said. He looked at her. I'm not connected to anything she has reason to distrust, Maris said. I'm another woman whose family was ruined by the same men who ruined hers. That's different from whatever you represent to her. Vance was quiet for a moment. You'd be willing to do that? I'm willing to do what needs doing, she said. That's what I told you last night. He nodded slowly. All right. What's the sister's name? Clara Bates. She's a seamstress, works out of a shop on the main street in Crenshaw. He paused. I need to say something about Crenshaw before we get there. Say it. Marshall Tate is there, and he's reliable. I believe that, and I've had it confirmed by 2 people I trust. But Crenshaw isn't clean the way the federal office is clean. The town marshal is a man named Pugh, and Pugh and Greer have an arrangement that I haven't been able to fully map, but that I know exists. Pugh doesn't enforce against Greer's operations in the county, and in return, Greer's men don't cause trouble in town. He looked at her steadily. What that means is that when we arrive in Crenshaw with evidence against Greer, we need to get to Tate's office without Pugh finding out first. If Pugh knows we're there before Tate does, we have a problem. How do we manage that? We don't ride in together, Vance said. You go first. Through the main street, visible. You go to Clara Bates's shop. You talk to Hannah Pruitt. You ask about the ledger. You're a woman traveling alone. Less interesting, less threatening. I come in through the south end, go straight to Tate. We meet at Tate's office. She thought about this. If something goes wrong, you don't know me, he said flatly. You're a free woman with a discharged debt and a clear deed traveling to Crenshaw on your own business. That's completely true, and you can say it to anyone who asks, including Pugh. She noticed he'd put her safety ahead of the case in the structure of his contingency. She also noticed he'd done it without making a show of it. All right, she said. It was late afternoon when they came to the low ridge that overlooked Crenshaw, and they stopped there to rest the horses and go over the plan once more. The town spread below them in the long valley, bigger than Blackthorn Crossing by a factor of 3 or 4, with a proper grid of streets and several 2-story buildings, and what appeared to be a working telegraph office, which was the kind of infrastructure that told you a place had real money in it somewhere. One more thing, Vance said. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded paper which he held out to her. If I'm delayed getting to Tate's office, for any reason, you give that to Tate directly. Don't leave it with anyone else. Don't let anyone hold it for you. Him, personally. She took it. It was heavier than a single sheet, several pages folded together. What is it? Summary of evidence. Names, dates, contract references, locations. Enough for Tate to start a formal investigation even without the physical documents. He paused. It's a copy. I have another. She folded it and put it inside her coat, against her shirt. You trust me with this? I bought $1,700 of your character this morning, he said. Yes. It startled a short laugh out of her. Not quite humor, but the recognition of something true said in an unexpected way. She hadn't laughed in 4 days, and the feeling of it was strange and welcome at once. He didn't smile exactly, but his face eased. Clara Bates, seamstress, Main Street, Maris said, getting herself back to the business of it. Hannah Pruitt, Abel's wife. The ledger. And don't rush her, Vance said. She's had 4 months of fear. Don't make her feel like she's being recruited for something she doesn't understand. Just talk to her like a person. I wasn't planning to do it any other way, Maris said. I know, he said. I'm saying it because I've made that mistake myself. When you've been focused on something for 8 months, it starts to feel urgent in a way that can make you seem... He searched for the word. Like you're using someone, she said. Yes, he said quietly. Yes, exactly that. She looked at him. There was something in the admission that cost him something, and he'd made it anyway. I'll be careful with her, Maris said. She put her heels to the gray mare and started down the ridge toward Crenshaw, and didn't look back. Clara Bates's shop had a narrow front window with 2 dress forms in it and a hand-lettered sign. The bell above the door was thin and bright. Inside smelled of cut fabric and chalk dust, and a woman in her 40s with dark circles under her eyes looked up from behind a cutting table when Maris came in. Help you? She said. Her voice was careful in the way that people's voices get careful when they've been worried for a long time. I'm looking for Hannah Pruitt, Maris said. I'm not going to explain myself to you first. I'll explain myself to her. But I need you to know that I'm not connected to Greer or any of his people, and what I have to say to her is important. My name is Maris Hale. The Hales had land on the South Creek out of Blackthorn Crossing, and Greer destroyed my family the same way he destroyed hers. Clara Bates looked at her for a long moment with the kind of look that measures a person against their words. Wait here, she said, and went through a door at the back. Maris waited. She looked at the dress forms in the window and the neat stacks of fabric on the shelves and the little hand-lettered price cards and thought about what it cost a person to keep something ordinary running when everything underneath it had gone wrong. The back door opened again and a woman came through. She was younger than Maris had expected, maybe 28, thin in the angular way of someone who hadn't been eating enough, with 2 young children pressed close to her sides like they'd been attached there. Her eyes went straight to Maris with an expression that was equal parts hope and dread, the expression of someone who'd been given bad news delivered politely too many times. You said your name was Hale, Hannah Pruitt said. Yes. Greer took our land the same way? Yes, Maris said. Fraudulent contract, compounding debt. Your husband documented it. Something moved through Hannah's face. How do you know that? Because the man who's trying to stop Greer has been collecting evidence for 8 months, and your husband's records are part of what he's gathered, or part of what he's trying to gather. Maris paused. Abel kept a ledger. Hannah's jaw tightened. Her hands, which had been at her sides, moved to the tops of her children's heads in a gesture that wasn't quite conscious, just reflex, just the instinct to hold what was still holdable. Abel kept everything, Hannah said. Her voice had gone quieter. He always said, something happened, the paper would matter more than anything else. He kept saying the paper was the only thing that would make anyone listen. He was right, Maris said. Do you still have it? A long silence. One of the children, the younger one, a girl maybe 5 years old, looked up at Maris with wide, uncomplicated curiosity. What happens if I give it to you? Hannah asked. It goes to a federal marshal named Tate, Maris said. Combined with other evidence, it might be enough to bring a formal investigation. It might get the men who took Abel into a court that actually has jurisdiction over what they did. Might, Hannah said. Might, Maris agreed. I won't tell you it's certain. Nothing out here is certain. But Abel kept that ledger because he believed the paper would matter. And I think he was right. And I think the best thing I can do for him right now is make sure it gets to someone who can use it. Hannah was quiet for a long time. Her daughter had taken hold of Maris's coat hem without quite meaning to, a small, unconscious grip. Maris looked down at the child and then back at Hannah. I need to know he's still alive first, Hannah said. Her voice broke on the last word just slightly, and she straightened her jaw against it. Before I do anything, before I trust anyone, I need to know Abel is alive. I don't know where he is, Maris said honestly, but the man I'm working with is trying to find out. And getting this to a federal marshal is the fastest way to create the kind of pressure that makes it harder for Greer to make people disappear permanently. She paused. I know that's not the answer you wanted. No, Hannah said. It isn't. I know. The two women stood in the seamstress shop in the late afternoon light, surrounded by the quiet, ordinary smell of fabric and chalk, and the silence between them held everything that couldn't be fixed with words. The absent husband, the months of fear, the children pressing close, the frontier's long indifference to all of it. Then Hannah Pruitt reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small, flat key. There's a box, she said, under the bed in the back room. Bring it to me. Abel Pruitt's ledger was a standard farm accounts book, the kind sold at any general store, its brown cover worn soft with handling. But when Maris opened it, she found it was nothing like a standard farm accounts book. It was a 4-year record of Abel Pruitt's war against a debt he'd never agreed to, conducted entirely in ink and careful handwriting, without witnesses, without expectation that anyone would ever read it. Names, dates, descriptions of conversations, sometimes reconstructed verbatim as best he could recall, payments made and receipts requested and refused, visits from Decker's men with physical descriptions, discrepancies between what he'd been told and what appeared on official documents, a timeline, annotated, of every escalation. Maris read 3 pages standing up and then sat down on Clara Bates's cutting stool because her legs had gone uncertain. Your husband was meticulous, she said. He was a careful man, Hannah said. She was watching Maris read with an expression that was almost too composed. The face of someone who'd been holding themselves together for so long that composure had become the only face she knew how to make. Maris stopped. This is exactly what we need. Then take it, Hannah said. Take it and make it mean something. Her voice was steady and fierce and entirely exhausted all at once. Because if it doesn't mean something, if this whole thing amounts to nothing and they keep Abel wherever they're keeping him, and my children grow up without their father, then I want to know I tried everything. I want to know I didn't keep this in a box under a bed while the one chance to use it walked out my door. Maris held the ledger. I'll make it mean something, she said, or I'll wear myself down to nothing trying. It wasn't a promise she could guarantee, but it was the only kind of promise worth making. She put Abel Pruitt's ledger inside her coat beside Vance's evidence summary, said goodbye to Hannah and the children and Clara Bates, and stepped back out into the Crenshaw street as the last of the afternoon light was pulling itself westward, leaving the town in the long blue shadow of coming dark. Tate's office was at the far end of the street. She started walking. Tate's office was a single room above a hardware store, accessed by an exterior staircase that ran up the building's south side. The stairs were iron, painted black, and they rang under Maris's boots as she climbed them. At the top, a door with a frosted glass panel that said, Federal Marshal's Office, 4th Circuit in faded gold lettering. A light was on inside. She knocked. It's open, a voice said. Marshal Tate was a man of maybe 50, lean and deliberate in the way that certain men get when they've been doing difficult work for a long time and have stopped wasting energy on anything that doesn't matter. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a desk covered in stacked paper and the general look of someone interrupted in the middle of something complicated. He looked at Maris the way he probably looked at everything, so quickly, thoroughly, without obvious reaction. Help you? He said. My name is Maris Hale, she said. I'm here about Silas Greer. Something sharpened in Tate's eyes. He took the reading glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. Close the door, he said. She did. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, because standing felt wrong, and pulled out the documents, Vance's evidence summary first, then Abel Pruitt's ledger, and set them on the desk in front of him. Tate looked at the ledger. He looked at the summary. He picked up the summary and began to read, and Maris waited, listening to the sounds of the street below and watching his face for what the pages did to it. He read for 6 minutes without speaking. She counted. Where's Vance? He said, without looking up. Coming in from the south end, she said. He should be here shortly. Tate turned a page. He sent you ahead. Oh, we split the approach, she said. Your town marshal and Greer have an arrangement. Tate's jaw tightened slightly. I'm aware of Pew. He set the summary down and picked up the ledger, opened it to the first page. Read, turned to the middle, read. Closed it and held it for a moment, his thumb running along the worn edge of the cover in a way that seemed almost unconscious, a gesture of recognition for what the thing had cost the man who'd made it. Abel Pruitt, he said quietly. His wife is here in Crenshaw, Maris said. She gave it to me an hour ago. Do you know where Abel is? No. Vance believes he may be in a labor operation in the Northern Territory, a mine site. Tate set the ledger down. He looked at Maris with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. How much do you know about what Vance has been building? Enough, she said. 6 principals, a dozen operators, 4 territories, a decade of fraudulent debt instruments, and labor auctions and land seizure. I know because I was standing on one of their auction platforms yesterday morning. Tate looked at her for a moment, taking that in. Yesterday, she said. He exhaled through his nose, not dramatically, just the small release of a man recalibrating something internal. And Vance bought you out. He stopped the auction and had the debt discharged, she said. I have the signed document. I'll need to see it. She produced it. He read it, nodded, set it with the other papers. The iron stairs outside rang with footsteps. 2 sets, Vance and someone else. Tate's hand moved toward the drawer of his desk, stopped when the door opened and Vance came in, followed by a man Maris didn't recognize. Younger, trail-worn, with a leather satchel held tight against his chest. Tate, Vance said. Vance? Tate looked at the younger man. His name is Garrett, Vance said, closing the door. He rode into Crenshaw an hour ahead of me. He has something you need to hear. Garrett was maybe 25, with the look of a man who'd been riding hard for days and running on something other than sleep. He set his satchel on the desk and opened it and produced a stack of papers that were loose and somewhat crumpled, as if they'd been pulled together in a hurry. I worked land registry out of the Harmon County office for 3 years, Garrett said. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't entirely. I've been copying documents for the past 4 months, every deed transfer, every debt judgment, every labor assignment that came through our office connected to the Greer Syndicate. He spread the papers on the desk beside the others. 47 transactions. 17 of them are land seizures where the original debt instrument was filed after the fact, meaning the seizure happened first, and the paperwork was created to justify it retroactively. The room went quiet. Tate looked at the papers. He looked at Vance. When did you find him? 6 weeks ago, Vance said. He contacted me. He'd been building his own record because he knew what he was seeing was wrong, and he didn't know who to take it to. He paused. I've been waiting until I had enough to make it impossible to dismiss. The Pruitt ledger is what I was missing. Tate stood up. He went to the window and looked down at the street for a long moment, his back to the room, and nobody spoke because it was clear he was thinking something through and interrupting it would be counterproductive. The Frontier Council gathering, he said finally to the window. I know, Vance said. Tate turned around. 3 days from now, in Ridgeback. Every major landholder and merchant in 4 territories. Greer will be there. All 6 principals will be there. It's the one occasion every year where they're all in the same building at the same time. I know, Vance said again. If we go through normal channels, file with the circuit court, wait for a formal investigation order, it takes weeks, maybe months. By the time a court order comes through, Greer will have moved his records, relocated his people, and possibly relocated Abel Pruitt somewhere harder to find. Tate looked at the desk covered in evidence. But if I can appear at that council gathering with a federal warrant and this documentation, you'd need a warrant issued in under 3 days, Vance said, from a circuit judge who isn't in Greer's pocket. Judge Alderman in Faro, Tate said. She's clean. I've worked with her twice. He paused. It's a hard ride. 40 miles, Vance said. I've done it in a day. I'll need to go myself to get the warrant, which means I'm not here. Tate looked at Maris and Garrett. Which means these documents cannot stay in this office while I'm gone. If Pew finds out what's here, we take them with us, Maris said. Both men looked at her. We take everything, and we ride to Ridgeback directly, she said. We don't wait for the warrant. We go ahead, we get there, and when Tate arrives with the warrant, everything is already in place. She looked at Vance. You said the council gathering is where they're all assembled. That's the moment. You ride into Ridgeback and you put the evidence in front of the whole room before anyone can stop you. The silence in the office had a different quality now. Not the silence of people thinking separately, but the silence of people thinking the same difficult thought. That's not a safe plan, Vance said. No, she agreed. But waiting 3 days in a town where the marshal works for Greer isn't safe either. And going through regular channels while Abel Pruitt sits in a mine somewhere isn't acceptable. She held Vance's look. You said you needed enough to make it impossible to dismiss. You have it now. The question is whether you're willing to use it. Vance looked at Tate. Tate looked at his desk covered in paper. She's not wrong, Tate said. Pugh found them an hour later. Maris had been downstairs holding the horses in the alley behind the hardware store when she heard the footsteps on the main street and looked up and saw the town marshal coming with 2 deputies flanking him. Pugh was a thick man, middle-aged, with the particular stillness of someone who'd learned to move slowly because people got nervous when men his size moved fast. He wore a badge that caught the last of the evening light. He wasn't coming to the hardware store. He was moving toward Tate's staircase. Maris tied off the horses and went up the stairs fast, taking them 2 at a time, and pushed through the door. Pugh's coming, she said. 30 seconds. Vance moved without hesitation. He swept the documents off the desk. Garrett got the ledger and his satchel, and Tate did something that surprised her. He sat back down at his desk, put his reading glasses back on, and picked up a completely unrelated piece of paper. Back window, Vance said quietly to Maris and Garrett. He pointed to a window at the rear of the office that opened onto the alley roof. Go down to the horses. Don't wait for me. Vance, I'll be right behind you, he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was already moving toward the door to intercept Pugh on the stairs. She went out the back window with Garrett behind her, dropping onto the sloped roof of the alley shed and then down to the ground. The horses were where she'd left them. She untied hers and Vance's and stood in the shadow of the building with the reins in her hands, listening. Above her, muffled through the building's rear wall, she could hear voices. Pugh's, low and deliberate. Tate's, pleasant and unhurried. Then Vance's. She hadn't expected to hear Vance's, but he must have stepped out onto the landing. His tone was the same as it always was, unbothered, giving nothing away. She couldn't make out the words. She stood in the dark alley with 2 horses, and Garrett breathing too fast beside her, and waited. 4 minutes. It felt much longer. Then Vance came around the corner of the building at a walk, not a run, calm, unhurried, as if he'd just concluded a perfectly ordinary conversation, and took his horse's reins from her hand. What did he want? She said quietly. To know if I was in town, Vance said. Someone told him. He wanted to remind me that Blackthorn Crossing is in the territory he has agreements with. He swung up into the saddle. Tate handled it. We need to move. What did you tell Pugh? That I was passing through, Vance said. Which is true. We are passing through. He looked at Garrett. Can you ride tonight? I can ride, Garrett said, with the conviction of a man who was not entirely sure but wasn't going to say otherwise. Ridgeback is 30 miles north, Vance said. We ride through the night, we arrive by morning. We find somewhere safe to wait. Tate gets the warrant from Alderman and meets us there. He paused. And then we go to the council. Maris looked at him. In the alley's darkness, she could see the pale gray of his eyes, and the set of his jaw, and the slight tension in the way he held himself that told her he'd made a decision and was holding it firmly because the alternative was going back over it endlessly. You're scared, she said. Not accusing, just naming it. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. Not defensive about it, not dismissive, just honest. Good, she said. Scared means you're paying attention. She put her heels to the gray mare, and they rode out of the alley into the Crenshaw night, 3 of them now, carrying enough paper to bring down an empire, if the empire didn't bring them down first. The 30 miles to Ridgeback were the longest of the journey, not because of distance, but because of what rode alongside them the whole way. The knowledge that Pugh would have sent word by now, that Greer would know where the evidence was and who was carrying it, that somewhere behind them or ahead of them, men were moving in response. They pushed the horses as hard as they dared. Not a flat run, which would break them down before morning, but a sustained, fast walk broken by stretches of canter, eating distance steadily. The night was cold and clear, the sky enormous, the land around them a dark flatness broken by the occasional black shape of a rock formation or a stand of trees. Around midnight, Garrett's horse pulled up lame. Not badly, a stone bruise probably from the rocky ground they'd crossed, but badly enough that pushing him further risked turning a minor problem into a serious one. Vance got down and checked the hoof, working by feel in the dark. "He can walk it out," Vance said, straightening, "but not at pace." Garrett looked stricken. "I can keep going." "The horse can't," Vance said. "Not at the speed we need." He looked at the animal, then at Garrett. "How much do you weigh?" "What?" "Your weight, roughly." "Maybe 150. Vance looked at his own horse, calculating. "Double up with me. We tie your horse loose. He'll follow at his own pace. When we get to Ridgeback, we find him a proper rest." Garrett looked uncomfortable. We don't have time to be proud about it," Vance said simply. They doubled up, Vance's dark bay carrying both of them with the labored patience of a good horse asked to do more than he'd been asked before. They slowed slightly but kept moving, and Garrett's horse followed behind on a loose lead, favoring the foot but managing. Maris rode beside them in silence for a while. Then she said, "Tell me about the council gathering. What does it actually look like?" "It's an annual meeting," Vance said, his voice carrying over the sound of the horses. "Started maybe 15 years ago as a legitimate thing. Landowners and merchants coming together to discuss water rights, road access, shared concerns. Over time, Greer's people took it over. Now it's essentially a governance body for the syndicate. They ratify decisions, approve new operations, divide territorial claims. It has the appearance of a legitimate civic institution." He paused. "Which is useful to them legally and useful to us strategically." "Useful how?" "Because it's a public gathering," he said. "They can't shoot us in a public gathering without witnesses. They can't make us disappear in front of 50 people the way they can on a dark road." He paused. "What they can do is deny everything, produce counter documents, use whatever legal leverage they have to delay and discredit, which is why we need Tate there with a federal warrant. Without the warrant, anything I say in that room is just a man making accusations. And with it? With it, the evidence triggers a mandatory federal hold. Greer and the principals can't conduct business, can't transfer assets, can't move people while the investigation is active. It freezes the operation." He paused. "It's not a conviction. It's not the end. But it's a wall between them and everything they do in the next 30 days to make the evidence disappear." Maris thought about Abel Pruitt's ledger, tucked inside her coat against her shirt. The worn cover. The careful handwriting. 4 years of a man doing the only thing he could think of to fight back against people who had all the power. "What if Tate doesn't make it in time?" she said. Vance was quiet for a beat. "Then we do it without the warrant, and we take what comes." "That's a bad plan." "It's not a plan," he said. "It's a last resort." "There's a difference?" "A plan is something you intend to use," he said. "A last resort is something you intend not to need." She looked at him in the darkness, this man she'd known for less than 2 days, sitting a horse that was carrying too much weight across 30 miles of night country toward a confrontation that might go very wrong in any number of ways. She thought about what he'd said in the camp the first night. "I wasn't going to sit at the end of that street and watch them put a woman on a block," and how it had been the plainest, least ceremonial statement of human decency she'd ever heard from a man she'd just met. "Vance," she said. "If this works," she started. "It has to work," he said, not harshly, just with the exhausted certainty of a man who'd been living inside this for 8 months and had run out of the capacity to consider the alternative. "There isn't another version where it doesn't work. Not for the Pruitts, not for the other families, so it works." She nodded. They rode the rest of the night without speaking much, and the darkness held around them, and somewhere ahead of them, Ridgeback waited with all its unknowns, and somewhere behind them Decker and his men were almost certainly moving, and the evidence rode warm against Maris's chest. 4 years of one careful man's faith that the paper would matter. It had to matter. It had to. That's Ridgeback in the early morning was a larger town than Blackthorn Crossing or Crenshaw, built at the junction of two freight roads, with a hotel and a livery and 3 saloons and a meeting hall that sat at the east end of the main street like a public declaration of civic importance. The Frontier Council would convene there the following morning. Already there were extra horses in the livery yards and unfamiliar wagons in the side streets. People arriving early, settling in, doing the preliminary business of powerful men preparing to sit down together. Vance got them rooms at a boarding house on the quiet north end of town, paying cash to a landlady who didn't ask questions, which suggested she'd learned that not asking questions was better for business. Garrett's horse was settled in a small paddock behind the house with feed and water and a poultice on the bruised foot. Maris sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a room that smelled of old wood and looked at Abel Pruitt's ledger in her hands. She opened it to a random page somewhere in the middle, a July entry from 2 years back, Abel's handwriting tight and careful, documenting a visit from Decker and a discrepancy in a quarterly statement. At the bottom of the entry, in slightly looser writing, as if added later, H says I should stop keeping this record, says it will make things worse. I told her I can't stop. If I don't write it down, it's like it didn't happen. She closed the ledger. Outside the window, Ridgeback was waking up. Horses in the street, a door banging somewhere, the smell of breakfast cooking from the main building below. One more day. She put the ledger back inside her coat and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning to finish arriving. Tate hadn't arrived by morning. Vance was up before dawn, standing at the boarding house window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, watching the street fill with the early traffic of Council Day. Wagons and horses and men in better coats than they'd wear on an ordinary morning. The particular bustle of people gathering for something that mattered to them. The meeting hall at the east end of the street had its doors propped open and 2 men sweeping the steps with the unhurried importance of men performing a ceremonial function. Maris came and stood beside him. She looked at the street and then at his face. "He'll come," she said. "Maybe," Vance said. "Faro is 40 miles. If something delayed him getting there, or delayed Alderman signing the warrant, then we wait. The council convenes at 9, he said. It's 7:30 now." He looked at the cold coffee and set it down on the windowsill. "If Tate isn't here by 8:30, we have a decision to make." She already knew what the decision was. They'd talked around it the night before without quite saying it plainly. Go in without the warrant and make the accusations publicly, hoping that the weight of the documentation and the presence of witnesses was enough to prevent Greer from simply having them removed, or wait for Tate and risk losing the moment, risk Greer finding out they were in Ridgeback before they had federal protection, risk another day in which Abel Pruitt sat in whatever hole he'd been put in. Neither option was good. That was the nature of last resorts. Garrett knocked on the door at 8 and came in looking like he'd slept badly, which he had. He'd been up twice in the night. Maris had heard him pacing, and his eyes had the particular flatness of someone who'd spent dark hours thinking through everything that could go wrong. He sat in the room's single chair and said nothing for a while. "My name will be on this," he said finally. "When it comes out, the registry documents, the testimony, my name's on it." "Yes," Vance said. "Greer knows people in 4 territories," Garrett said. "His people will know it was me inside a week." "Yes," Vance said again. He didn't soften it, didn't offer reassurance that probably wouldn't land true anyway. "That's real." Garrett looked at the floor for a moment, then he said, "Abel Pruitt kept that ledger for 4 years knowing the same thing, knowing that if Greer's men found it, it would make things worse." He was quiet. "A man I never met was braver than me for 4 years. I figure I can manage one morning." Neither Vance nor Maris said anything. Some statements don't need a response. They just need to be witnessed. At 8:20, hoofbeats came up the north road fast. Tate came through the boarding house door at 8:27 with dust on his coat and a folded document in his hand and the look of a man who'd ridden through the night and was running on the knowledge that stopping wasn't yet an option. "Alderman signed it at midnight," he said, without preamble. "I've been writing since." He held up the document. "Federal warrant, 4 territories, all 6 principals named, Mandatory investigative hold on all associated assets. He looked at Vance. You have the evidence? Everything, Vance said. Then we have about 30 minutes before that meeting opens. Tate looked around the room. At Vance, at Maris, at Garrett, taking a quick accounting of who was present and what they were carrying. I need to understand who's walking in there and what role each of you plays. I present the evidence, Vance said. I've been building the case. I know every document, every name, every connection. The presentation has to come from me. I testify to the debt fraud, Maris said. I was on that auction platform. I have the original contract, the payment records, the discharge document. I'm a direct witness. And I'm the registry source, Garrett said. I can speak to the fraudulent filing procedures from inside the system. 47 transactions documented. Tate nodded. He was still breathing hard from the ride, but his mind was clearly running clean. When we go in, I lead. The warrant gives me legal authority to interrupt the proceedings. It's not a request, it's a federal instrument. Greer's people will try to challenge it, try to claim jurisdictional issues, try to create confusion in the room. You don't respond to that. You let me handle the legal challenges and you keep the evidence in hand and you stay close together. He looked at each of them. Questions? Decker, Maris said. He may be in that room. Almost certainly, Tate said. He won't accept this quietly. No, Tate agreed. He won't. He tucked the warrant inside his coat and looked at Vance. You know what you're walking into. I know, Vance said. You've done harder things, Tate said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement offered as ballast, the kind of thing one man says to another when both of them are about to do something that requires the steadiness of remembering they've survived difficulty before. Vance looked at him for a moment. Not many. The meeting hall was 3/4 full by the time they arrived. Long tables arranged in a rectangle, men seated along the outside edges, a central open space that served as the floor for address. Perhaps 60 people in the room, landowners, merchants, a handful of lawyers, several men who were clearly security of one kind or another stationed at the walls. The air was warm with too many bodies and smelled of coffee and wood polish, and the particular tension of assembled power preparing to conduct its business. Silas Greer sat at the far end of the central table. He was in conversation with two men beside him when the doors opened, and he didn't look up immediately. Calloway was 2 seats down. Decker stood near the right-hand wall, not seated, positioned, the way a man positions himself when his function is to respond to problems rather than participate in discussion. Decker saw them first. His face changed in a way that was very small and very significant. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift of weight onto the balls of his feet. Then Greer looked up. Tate walked to the center of the room and held up the warrant. Federal Marshal Jonas Tate, 4th Circuit, he said in the carrying voice of a man who'd addressed difficult rooms before. I am executing a federal investigative warrant under the authority of the Frontier Territories Act, naming Silas Greer, Warren Calloway, and 4 other principals in connection with systemic debt fraud, unlawful labor seizure, and fraudulent land transfer across 4 territories. This warrant supersedes local jurisdictional authority and mandates an immediate hold on all associated business proceedings. He looked around the room steadily. This gathering is temporarily suspended pending the presentation of evidence. The room erupted. Not all at once. It happened in a wave, starting with the men nearest Greer, spreading outward. Voices overlapping, outrage, confusion, the sound of chairs scraping back. 2 men near the door stood up. Calloway was on his feet immediately, face red, pointing at Tate and saying something that was lost in the noise. Greer did not stand up. He sat very still at the far end of the table and looked at Vance, and in that look was the cold arithmetic of a man calculating whether there was a move left that would work. His merchant's smile was entirely gone. This is an illegal interruption of a lawful civic assembly, one of the lawyers near the center table said loudly, establishing position. You have no authority. The warrant is issued under Federal Statute 742, Tate said just as loudly and held it out to the lawyer. Read it. If you find an error in the instrument, I'll address it. If you don't, sit down. The lawyer took the warrant. Read it. His expression did the slow, unhappy work of a man discovering that the argument he'd planned to make wasn't going to hold. Vance stepped forward. He had the document stack, Garrett's registry papers, Maris's contract and payment records, his own evidence summary, and he set them on the central table where the whole room could see them. "My name is Rhett Vance," he said. "I've spent 8 months documenting what the Greer Syndicate has done in this territory. I'm going to summarize it now, and then the documents on this table will be submitted to Marshall Tate's formal record, and then every man in this room is going to have to make a decision about which side of this they want to be on." "No, this man is a wanted criminal," Calloway started. "Warrant cleared Dobson County 8 weeks ago," Vance said. "Check with the circuit marshal's office. I'll wait." He said it the same way he'd said it in Blackthorn Crossing, with the same flat patience, and it had the same effect. Calloway's momentum stalled. Vance began to speak. He'd done this in his head probably 100 times over 8 months, assembled the evidence into its clearest form, found the sequence that showed not just individual crimes, but the system, the deliberate structure of it, the way the debt instruments and the labor claims and the land seizures interlocked into something that had been designed from the beginning to take land from people who couldn't protect themselves. He spoke for maybe 10 minutes, plainly, without theater, and the room got quieter as he went because there is a particular kind of silence that falls when people are hearing something they already suspected was true and are being given the language to understand it. Then Maris stepped forward. "My name is Maris Hale," she said. 3 days ago I was standing on an auction block in Blackthorn Crossing." She paused, letting the room sit with that. "The debt that put me there belonged to my father, who died 6 years ago. He borrowed $240 during a drought. By the time they came for me, Silas Greer's company had converted that debt, through a compounding rate hidden in a margin notation that my father couldn't read, into over $1,000. She reached into her coat and laid the original contract on the table, followed by the payment record in her own handwriting. My family paid over $300 against that debt across 6 years. Every payment made it bigger. That's not a loan, that's a trap." The room was very quiet now. She looked down the table at Greer. "I watched you smile when they walked me up those steps," she said. "That's the last time you get to do that." Greer opened his mouth. Decker moved. He came off the wall fast, not toward Tate or Vance, toward the table, toward the documents, and it was clear what he intended. Vance stepped between him and the table, and Decker pulled up short, and the two men stood 2 feet apart in the center of the room with the particular stillness that precedes violence when both parties are experienced enough to be calculating rather than reacting. "Don't," Vance said, quietly. Just the one word. Decker looked at him. The calculation ran behind his eyes, visible in the way his weight shifted and resettled. He was measuring something. Odds, consequences, the full room watching, Tate's hand near his sidearm at the edge of Decker's peripheral vision. "It's over," Vance said. Still quiet. "The documents are in the room. 60 people just heard it. There's no version of the next 10 minutes where anything you do makes this better." Something moved through Decker's face, not quite resignation, but the mechanical acknowledgement of a man whose options have run out. He stepped back. Once, then again. He looked at Greer. Greer was still sitting. He looked for the first time since Maris had known of him, like an old man, not physically diminished, but as if the thing that had animated him, the confidence of unchallenged power, had gone out like a lamp with no oil left in it. "Silas Greer," Tate said, "you are subject to the terms of this federal warrant. You will surrender any documents relating to the Greer Land and Finance Company's debt instruments and labor assignment records to my custody, effective immediately." Greer looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at the warrant, still in his hands, and then did something that mattered more than anything the lawyer might have said. He set the warrant down on the table gently, without argument, and sat down. It was a small motion, but in a room full of people watching, it meant everything. Well, what happened next was not clean or swift the way it would be in a story told by someone who hadn't been there. It was an hour of hard, contested work. Greer's other lawyers attempting procedural challenges. 2 of the armed men near the wall making a calculation about whether to act and deciding against it. One of the lesser syndicate members in the back of the room standing up abruptly and beginning to talk, loudly, about what he knew and had been afraid to say, which destabilized the room further. That last part was the one nobody had planned for. His name was Fulton, a smaller land broker from the Eastern Territory, mid-level, not one of the principals, a man who'd been doing business with Greer's syndicate because it was the business available and who had clearly been sitting with his discomfort about it for a long time and had chosen this morning, in this room, with everything suddenly in motion, to let it out. He wasn't heroic about it. He was shaking, his voice cracked twice, and what he said was more damaging to his own position than he probably realized. But he said it, and the room heard it, and two other men exchanged a look, and then one of them began to talk as well. Calloway tried to leave. He made it to the door before Tate's voice stopped him with the flat authority of the warrant and the two men standing near the exit who, it turned out, Tate had arranged to be there. Hired deputies from Faro arrived an hour before the council opened, positioned without fanfare. Calloway stopped at the door. He looked back at the room. He looked at Greer, still seated at the far end of the table with the demolished composure of a man watching something he'd built over 20 years come apart in a single morning. He sat down. Maris stood beside the central table and watched it happen, all of it, and she felt none of the triumph she'd imagined. What she felt was a kind of exhausted relief that was almost indistinguishable from sadness. The feeling of a weight removed that had been in place so long that its absence had its own weight. She felt the raw skin of her wrists under her sleeves, still tender. She felt the worn corner of Abel Pruitt's ledger pressing against her ribs inside her coat. Vance came and stood beside her. He looked at the room, the controlled chaos of it, Tate working the legal levers, Garrett producing document after document for the record, the syndicate members calculating their exposure, and said nothing for a moment. "The Pruitts," Maris said. "Tate will move on the mine sites inside 48 hours, Vance said. "The warrant covers labor seizure. If Abel is there, they'll find him." "If," she said. "If," he agreed. He didn't take it back or soften it. She nodded. There were things you couldn't resolve in a single morning, even a morning that accomplished everything it set out to accomplish. Abel Pruitt was still somewhere unknown. Hannah was still waiting. The ledger had done its work, but the man who'd kept it hadn't been found yet. "There's more to do," she said. "Yes," Vance said. "Then let's not waste the morning," she said. She picked up the original Hale contract from the table, her father's name at the top, the margin notation on the third page that had cost everything, and brought it to Tate, who was building the formal evidentiary record with the systematic focus of a man who'd been waiting a long time to do exactly this. "Add this," she said, and placed it in his hands. Tate looked at the document, then at her. "It'll be part of the permanent record," he said. "Good," she said. "Make sure it stays there." Abel Pruitt was found 11 days after the Ridgeback Council. Tate's deputies located him at a silver extraction operation 40 miles into the Northern Territory, a privately run labor camp that kept no public manifest and accepted no official inspections, which had been the arrangement for 6 years between the camp's operator and two of Greer's principals. There were 14 men in that camp when the deputies arrived. Abel was one of them. His son was another. Maris heard about it secondhand from a letter Tate sent to Vance that Vance read to her at the kitchen table of the boarding house in Ridgeback, where they'd remained while the legal process ground through its initial stages. The letter was factual. Tate wrote the way he spoke, without ornamentation. But the facts were enough. Abel Pruitt was alive. His son was alive. Both were in poor condition from months of hard labor and inadequate food, but neither was beyond recovery. They were being transported to Crenshaw under federal escort. She had to read the relevant part twice before she trusted it. Then she sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed. Vance watched her. He didn't say anything for a moment, didn't offer the reflexive reassurance that people offer when someone is feeling something large. He just let her have it. "I want to tell Hannah myself," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I already wrote back to Tate. He's holding notification until you can get there." She looked at him. He'd anticipated it, had done the quiet, practical thing before she'd even asked, because he understood that some news needed to travel through the right hands. That was Vance, she'd come to understand over the past 11 days. Not a man who performed consideration, but a man who practiced it in small, ordinary ways without announcing it. "We leave tomorrow?" she said. "Tonight, if you want," he said. Tonight, she said. The road to Crenshaw was the same road they'd ridden in darkness 11 days before, but it was a different road now, not in any physical sense, but in the way that familiar ground changes when the thing you were running toward has become the thing you're returning from. The urgency was different. The fear was different. Not gone exactly. There were still proceedings underway, still lawyers and depositions, and the slow institutional machinery of federal investigation, but it had changed character. It was no longer the fear of whether anything would happen. It was the more ordinary, more manageable fear of whether everything that needed to happen would happen correctly. They rode through the night again, but this time they talked more. Not about the case, about other things. The miscellaneous things that people talk about when the immediate crisis has eased enough to let ordinary conversation back in. She told him about growing up on the homestead, about her father's hands and the specific smell of the South Creek in summer, and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. He told her somewhat reluctantly and in pieces about the 12 years of moving, not romanticizing it, just describing it honestly, the towns and the jobs and the occasional violence and the long stretches of solitude that he'd come to understand were a choice he was making, not a condition being imposed on him. "You could have stopped anywhere," she said, "along the way." "Could have," he said, "but you didn't." "No," he said. He was quiet for a stretch of road. "I told myself it was about the work, the cases, the evidence, the people who needed help, and that's true. But there's also a version of constant movement that's about not being somewhere long enough to have anything to lose." He said it without self-pity, just the flat recognition of a man who'd examined something about himself and found it honest, if not entirely flattering. "Moving is easier than staying. I'd gotten very good at the easier thing." She rode beside him and didn't say anything immediately, because what he'd said was real, and real things don't need to be filled in with words. "Is that still true?" she said after a while. He looked at her sideways. The moon was up, and the land was silver and dark around them. "I'm less certain than I was," he said. But Hannah Pruitt was in Clara Bates's back room when they arrived in Crenshaw near dawn, asleep on a narrow cot with her 2 younger children pressed against her on either side, the practiced compaction of a family that had learned to take up less space than they needed. Clara opened the back door herself. She'd been expecting them. Tate had sent word, and looked at their faces and understood what the faces meant before anyone spoke. She went and woke Hannah gently, a hand on the shoulder, a word in the ear. Hannah sat up with the reflexive alertness of someone who'd learned to come awake quickly, and she looked at Maris standing in the doorway, and whatever she read in Maris's expression moved through her face in a wave that was almost too large to watch. Hope and terror, and the desperate effort not to believe it before she was sure, because believing and being wrong would have been unendurable. "He's alive," Maris said. "Abel and your son. Both of them. Tate's people have them, and they're bringing them here." Hannah Pruitt made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a cry. Something in between, something that had been held down for 4 months under the weight of not knowing, and now came up all at once, uncontrolled and entirely human. She put both hands over her mouth. Her children, woken by the sound, pressed closer to her on the cot and looked at Maris with wide, uncertain eyes. Maris crossed the room and sat on the edge of the cot and put her arms around Hannah, who was shaking, and held her while she shook. She didn't say everything was going to be fine, because everything wasn't necessarily going to be fine. Abel and the boy would need time and rest, and the kind of slow recovery that couldn't be promised or scheduled. There was still testimony ahead of Hannah, still the ordeal of formal proceedings, still the work of rebuilding what had been taken. But he was alive. The boy was alive. The rest was work, and work was manageable, and manageable was enough. The formal proceedings against the Greer Syndicate ran for 4 months, through 2 circuit courts and a federal review panel. Maris testified 3 times, once in Crenshaw, once in the regional capital, once before the panel itself, which convened in a large room with high windows and the particular institutional gravity of a process that was taking itself seriously. She got better at it each time. Not more comfortable. Testimony is always uncomfortable when the things you're describing were done to you, but more precise. She learned to let the facts carry the weight rather than her anger, which was what Vance had told her after the first deposition. The anger is real and it's justified, but the facts don't need it. The facts are enough on their own. He testified as well, and Garrett, and Hannah Pruitt, and Abel himself, who had recovered enough by the third week to sit in a formal proceeding and speak in a clear voice about what had been done to his family and what he documented and why. The ledger was entered into the formal record as Exhibit 14. When the panel's presiding officer noted, on the record, that the ledger represented an extraordinary example of sustained documentary evidence maintained under extreme personal risk, Abel had looked at his hands and said, "I just wrote down what happened." And that had been that. The 6 principals were charged on a combined 41 counts spanning fraud, unlawful labor seizure, falsification of public records, and conspiracy. Greer himself was arrested in his home in Blackthorn Crossing on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after Ridgeback, by 2 federal deputies who came to his door at 6 in the morning while he was still in his dressing coat. Decker was taken the following day at a relay station in the Eastern Territory, attempting to leave the region with a saddlebag full of documents that he'd been planning to destroy. The documents turned out to be additional evidence. Calloway negotiated a cooperation agreement. The panel accepted it, which meant reduced charges in exchange for testimony against the principals. Maris thought about Calloway sitting in his cooperation hearings, trading names for leniency, and felt something she couldn't cleanly classify. Not satisfaction, because Calloway was a small and frightened man doing the calculating thing that small and frightened men do. More like the recognition that justice, when it comes, rarely arrives in the form you imagined. 3 of the 6 principals received prison sentences. The other 3 were acquitted on the more serious charges but convicted on lesser counts, fined heavily, and stripped of their territorial operating licenses. Their land holdings were placed under federal review for fraudulent acquisition, with affected families given standing to file restitution claims. Burkhart, the land registrar who'd turned Maris away twice, resigned before the proceedings concluded and left the territory. Nobody arrested him, which was an imperfect outcome. She knew it was imperfect, and she accepted it the way you accept the things you can't fully fix. Not gladly, but honestly, without pretending the gap wasn't there. Blackthorn Crossing changed slowly, the way settlements change. Not all at once, not with ceremony, but through the accumulation of small alterations. The auction platform was torn down in the 2nd month after Ridgeback by a group of settlers who did it early one morning without making an announcement about it, just took it down board by board and carted the lumber away. Nobody objected. The cleared space sat empty for a while, and then gradually, without formal planning, became the place where people gathered. Market days, the occasional meeting, the informal exchange that communities need to function. Eventually someone put a bench there, and then another bench, and it became a recognizable thing, a public square, modest and imperfect, built on the site of something that had been wrong. The land office got a new registrar, appointed by federal oversight, a woman from the Eastern Territory named Sayers, who had a reputation for precision and a notable disinclination to be pressured. She wasn't perfect, no registrar is, but she was honest, which was the thing that mattered most in a place that had been run by dishonesty for a long time. Maris came back to Blackthorn Crossing in the spring. She hadn't been certain she wanted to. The place carried everything that had happened to her, the platform and the jailhouse and the street that had watched in silence. But she came back because the homestead was there, the land was there, and the land was hers, cleared and documented and held by her name on a deed that Sayers had personally verified. Her father had died believing the land was gone. She wanted to stand on it and know that it wasn't. She stood on it the first morning back, in the south field where the creek ran close and the grass came up thick from the winter wet, and she stood there for a long time in the early light and thought about her father and about the South Creek and about the water bugs skating across the surface. She thought about the woman on the auction platform 3 days before, who'd fixed her eyes above the crowd and breathed steadily and held herself together. She didn't feel distant from that woman. She felt continuous with her. The same person, carrying more weight now, some of it the right kind. Adeline Marsh had held the homestead key for months, had kept an eye on the property, had chased off 2 different men who'd come around testing whether the place was truly unoccupied and therefore available. When Maris came to her door, Adeline looked at her for a moment and then said, "I kept the window boxes going. The flowers are still dead, but the boxes are there." It was the most tender thing Adeline was capable of saying, which meant it was enough. The families filing restitution claims needed someone who understood the process. Maris, who had spent 3 months in federal proceedings and had read more land contract law than most lawyers in the territory, understood the process. She started informally. A family would come to her, confused by the paperwork, and she'd sit at her kitchen table and go through it with them, explaining what each document meant and what they needed to file and in what order. Then more families came. Then it was less informal. She wasn't a lawyer, she said that clearly, every time. But she knew what the document said, and she knew how the system worked, and she knew, in the specific practical way of someone who'd been through it personally, what the traps were and where the honest path ran. Abel Pruitt came to her one morning in late summer. He and Hannah had returned to their homestead, which was being restored under the restitution process, and sat across her kitchen table and said, "I want to help you with this. Whatever you're doing here, I want to be part of it." She looked at him. He was thinner than he'd been before, she assumed, from the months in the labor camp, and he carried himself with a careful quality, as if he was still relearning the ordinary weight of a free day. But his eyes were clear. "You know what it costs," she said. "You know who you have to be willing to go up against." "I kept a ledger for 4 years in a house full of people who could have found it," he said. "I know what it costs." She nodded. "Then sit down," she said. "Let me show you what we're working on." Nut. Vance came back to Blackthorn Crossing in early fall. He'd been gone 3 months. There was other work, other territories, the kind of absence that a person who'd lived 12 years in motion would take without apology and without needing to explain. She'd expected it, and she'd been fine with it, mostly, though there had been a week in August when she'd found herself talking to Adeline about him at length and had stopped in the middle of a sentence and understood from Adeline's expression that she'd been making something plain without intending to. He rode in on the same dark bay. The horse looked better than the last time she'd seen him, rested and properly fed, and came to the homestead and tied his horse at the fence post and knocked on the door as if he wasn't certain what kind of reception he'd get. She opened the door. "You could have written," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't." "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table the way they'd sat at tables in Crenshaw and Ridgeback and the boarding house and the seamstress's back room. And she told him what had happened in his absence, the restitution claims, Abel Pruitt's involvement, the way the South Field had come back with the rains, the new land registrar, the bench in the public square. He listened the way he always listened, with the full attention of someone who understood that listening was an active thing, not a pause in talking. When she'd finished, he looked at his coffee for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I said on the road," he said, "about moving being easier than staying." "I remember," she said. "I'm tired of the easy thing," he said. It came out simply, without the careful scaffolding of a man who'd rehearsed what he was going to say. Just the plain statement of something he'd arrived at after 3 months of looking at it from different angles. She looked at him across the table. The morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always had. The south-facing light, the good light, the one her mother used to say was the best light in the house. "There's work here," she said. "Real work. The kind that takes years." "I know," he said. "I'm not promising it goes a certain way," she said. "Between us. I'm not going to pretend I know what this is because I've known you for 4 months and half of that time you weren't here." "That's fair," he said. "What I know," she said, "is that when I was standing on that platform, you didn't ride past." She paused. "And everything after that, you were exactly who you appeared to be, which is rarer than it should be." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not easy to know," he said. "I want to be honest about that." "Neither am I," she said. Outside, the south field was green in the fall light, and the creek ran its quiet line along the property edge, and somewhere in the distance a horse moved in its paddock. The frontier stretched in every direction, stubborn and hard and indifferent to the struggles of any individual person, unchanged by everything that had happened, as it had always been and probably always would be. But Blackthorn Crossing had a public square now where an auction platform had been. Families were filing claims on land that had been taken from them. Abel Pruitt was home, and his son was home, and Hannah was keeping their books and talking about planting in the spring. Garrett was working in the new land registry office in Crenshaw, making sure the documents were what they said they were. A man who'd spent 12 years moving had knocked on a door and not been certain of his welcome, and a woman who'd been sold on a platform for $1,100 was sitting in her own kitchen deciding what kind of future she was willing to build. None of it had happened cleanly. None of it was finished. Justice in the territories was like everything else in the territories: partial, ongoing, requiring constant maintenance, resistant to the idea that it could ever be fully settled. The people who'd been harmed were not unhurt by the fact that their hurts had been acknowledged. The men who'd escaped prosecution were still out there somewhere. The frontier itself was what it had always been, vast and indifferent, waiting for whoever was stubborn enough to keep working at it. What Maris had learned, what the whole long road from the auction block to this kitchen table had taught her, not as a lesson delivered but as a truth absorbed slowly through experience, was that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep going inside the fear, to be afraid of all the real things, and keep moving anyway. That decency wasn't a quality people either had or didn't have. It was a choice, made repeatedly, under pressure, sometimes at cost. That the paper mattered. Abel Pruitt had been right about that, and her father had been right to sign his name to things even when he didn't fully understand them, because the name on the paper meant someone had been there, someone had existed, and that couldn't be taken back even when everything else was. She thought about her father sometimes, still, about the letter he'd never sent. She hoped, she'd decided to believe that whatever a person carries forward from the people they've lost, he'd be able to see what she'd done with the wreckage of what he'd left her. She'd made it mean something. That was the most honest thing she could say about any of it. "There's a settlement 20 miles west," she said. 3 families there in the same situation ours was. They don't know about the restitution process yet. She looked at Vance. "I was planning to ride out there next week." He nodded. "I know the road." "I know you do," she said. She poured more coffee into both cups, and outside the south field lay green and quiet in the morning, and the work that still needed doing waited with the patient indifference of work that knows it will get done eventually, because the people doing it don't have the option of walking away. That was enough. It had always been enough. It was just that sometimes you had to lose nearly everything before you understood it.